The ground beneath the lead horse collapsed inward without warning. Not a sinkhole. Something pulled from below. We heard a wet hiss rise from the sand. The air smelled of burned copper. Our guide turned his mount and rode hard without speaking. We should have followed. I still remember the weight of the jade in my saddlebag that summer in 1867, and the way it pressed against my ribs with every step. We were 14 men crossing from Kalgan to Kobdo with trade goods. The Gobi stretched flat and white in all directions. Our caravan master was a Russian named Volkov, who had made the crossing 11 times before. He wore a long coat of felt and a fur cap even in the heat. His face was dark from years under the sun, and his hands showed scars from rope and weather. He spoke Mongolian and Chinese with equal ease and kept a small brass compass in his breast pocket that he checked every hour. He trusted instruments more than he trusted men. The rest of us were traders, porters, and hired guards. Chen was a silk merchant from Peking, carrying bolts of embroidered fabric wrapped in oiled canvas. Bater and his cousin Temur were Mongolian horse handlers who managed our string of 16 mounts. Grigory was Volkov's nephew, younger and eager, with a rifle he cleaned twice daily. The others were laborers whose names I learned slowly during the journey. We carried tea, jade, ceramics, and small amounts of silver. The route from Kalgan through the southern Gobi to Kobdo was old but dangerous. Bandits worked the passes, and water was scarce between the wells. We left Kalgan in late spring when the grass was still green along the edges of the desert. The first 3 days passed without incident. We rose before dawn, loaded the horses, and walked until the heat forced us to rest. The horses carried the heavy goods. We walked beside them to spare their strength. At midday, we stopped in whatever shade we could find, which was often nothing more than the shadow of a cart or a length of canvas stretched between poles. We ate cold millet and dried meat. Water was rationed. Each man received a small cup at noon and another at dusk. Volkov watched the barrels and marked the levels with a knife. The terrain changed gradually. The grass thinned and gave way to gravel plains scattered with low shrubs. The ground turned pale and reflected the light in a way that made distances hard to judge. The horizon shimmered. The air grew dry and pulled moisture from our lips and throats. We wrapped cloth around our faces to keep the dust out. Our boots wore through at the seams and had to be patched with strips of leather. At night, the temperature dropped fast. We gathered dried dung for fuel and built small fires that gave more smoke than warmth. The sky opened wide and clear. Stars filled every space above us. I had never seen so many. Grigory said they were closer here because the land was high. I did not know if that was true, but it felt true. On the 5th day, we reached a stone well marked on Volkov's map. The well was shallow, and the water tasted of minerals, but it was clean enough. We refilled the barrels and let the horses drink their fill. Bater checked their hooves and found 2 that needed new wrapping. We stayed at the well through the afternoon and into the evening. Volkov wanted the animals rested before the next stretch. The next reliable water was 4 days away if we kept a steady pace. That night, Temur pointed to the western horizon, where a line of dark clouds sat low against the earth. It did not move. Volkov studied it for a long time and then told us to secure everything that could blow away. He said a sandstorm was building, and we should expect it by morning. We doubled the ropes on the canvas and stacked the heavier goods to anchor the loads. The horses grew restless. They pulled at their tethers and stamped their hooves. Bater sang to them in a low voice to calm them. His song had no words I recognized. It sounded old. The storm reached us near dawn. It came as a wall of wind and sand that blotted out the stars. The air turned thick and yellow. Breathing became difficult. We tied cloth over our mouths and noses and crouched behind the carts. The wind tore at the canvas and ripped one sheet free. It vanished into the dark. Sand filled our eyes and ears. The noise was constant and overwhelming. It sounded like a river running over stone. The storm lasted through the morning and into the afternoon. When it finally passed, we were covered in a fine layer of dust that had worked its way into every seam and pocket. The horses were coated. Their eyes showed white with fear. We spent the rest of that day digging out the carts and checking the loads. One barrel had cracked and lost half its water. Volkov cursed in Russian and then in Mongolian. He recalculated our supply and cut the rations further. We would have to push harder to reach the next well before the water ran out. That evening, we ate without speaking. The fire would not stay lit. The wind kept gusting and scattering the embers. It was Chen who noticed the marks first. He had walked a short distance from camp to relieve himself and called out when he saw them. We gathered around with lanterns. The sand showed a depression that ran in a straight line for 30 paces before disappearing. The depression was narrow at one end and wider at the other. It looked as though something heavy had been dragged across the surface, but there were no tracks leading to it or away from it. Only the furrow itself. Batur crouched and ran his fingers along the edge. The sand was compressed, but not disturbed in the way a wheel or a sledge would leave it. He spoke to Tamer in their language. Tamer shook his head. Volkov asked what they were saying. Batur stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. He said the mark was not made by any animal he knew. He said it reminded him of stories his grandfather told about things that moved under the sand during storms. Volkov told him not to spread fear with old tales. Batur did not argue, but I saw his face in the lantern light. He was not joking. We returned to camp and posted a double watch. Grigory and I took the first shift. We sat with our backs to a cart and kept our rifles across our knees. The night was still. The stars returned. I listened for any sound that did not belong. An hour passed, then 2. Grigory whispered that he wanted to walk the perimeter. I told him to stay close. He moved around the edge of our camp with his lantern held low. I watched his light swing back and forth. He stopped suddenly. His light froze. He called my name. I went to him and saw what had caught his attention. Another furrow had appeared in the sand. This one crossed between 2 of our carts. It had not been there when we set the watch. Grigory's hand shook on the lantern handle. I told him to wake Volkov. We needed to move. Volkov came out in his shirt and boots. He examined the furrow without touching it. He asked if anyone had left camp during the watch. I said no one had. He asked if we had heard anything. I said the night had been silent. He stood and looked at the dark beyond our firelight. He said we would break camp at first light and move fast. He did not explain further. He did not need to. We woke the others and began loading in the dark. The horses resisted. They pulled against the leads and rolled their eyes. Batur spoke to them, but they would not calm. Timur said they smelled something wrong. Volkov told him to get them moving or leave them behind. We worked quickly. The sky began to pale. We were nearly ready when the ground beneath the lead horse gave way. The horse screamed and dropped to its chest. The sand around it funneled downward into a sudden pit. Batur ran forward and grabbed the reins. The horse thrashed and kicked. Its rear hooves found purchase, and it lunged up and out of the collapsing ground. Bater pulled it away from the edge. The pit stopped widening. It was perhaps 3 feet across and deep enough that I could not see the bottom in the dim light. Volkov approached the edge and knelt. He picked up a stone and dropped it in. We listened. The stone did not strike bottom, or if it did, the sound did not carry back to us. Volkov stood and backed away. He said we leave now. No one questioned him. We led the horses away from the pit and formed a line. Volkov took the front. Batur and Timur kept the horses grouped tight. Grigory and I walked rear guard. The sun rose behind us and lit the desert in shades of orange and pale yellow. The ground looked smooth in all directions. Nothing moved, but I felt watched. It was not a thought. It was a pressure in my chest that would not ease. We walked for 2 hours without rest. The heat built. Sweat soaked through my shirt and dried in salt lines. My mouth tasted of copper and dust. Volkov finally called a halt near a low rise of stone that offered a sliver of shade. We drank sparingly and checked. The horses. One had a cut on its foreleg. Timur cleaned it and wrapped it with cloth. Chen asked Volkov how far to the next well. Volkov said 3 days if we kept this pace. Chen asked what we were running from. Volkov did not answer. That afternoon the wind picked up again. It came from the north and carried grit that stung exposed skin. The horizon darkened. Another storm was building. Volkov cursed and looked for shelter. There was none. The land stretched flat in every direction. He ordered us to circle the horses and carts and cover everything we could. We worked fast. The wind grew stronger. The first sand began to fall like rain. It hissed against the canvas and piled in drifts around our boots. The storm hit with full force just before dusk. Visibility dropped to nothing. I could not see my hand in front of my face. The wind howled and the sand drove horizontal. I crouched behind a cart with my arms over my head. Time became meaningless. I counted breaths to keep my mind steady. The roar was so loud I could not hear the man beside me even when he shouted. Then I felt it, a vibration through the ground, low and rhythmic. Not the storm, something else. I pressed my palm flat against the sand. The vibration pulsed. It was moving. I tried to call out, but the wind swallowed my voice. I reached for the man next to me. It was Grigory. I grabbed his shoulder and pointed down. He felt it too. His eyes went wide. The vibration grew stronger. It passed directly beneath us. The sand shifted and sank a fraction. One of the horses screamed. The sound cut through the storm, then another horse. Then all of them at once. The carts rocked. Something struck the underside of the cart I leaned against. The impact was hard enough to lift the wheels off the ground for a moment. I rolled away and tried to stand. The wind knocked me down. The storm began to ease as quickly as it had come. The wind dropped, the sand settled, visibility returned. I stood and looked around. The others were pulling themselves up from where they had taken cover. Volkov shouted for a count. We called out one by one. Everyone answered except Chen. Volkov called his name again. No response. We found his body 30 paces from the carts. He lay on his side in the sand. His clothes were burned through in several places. The skin beneath was black and blistered. There was no blood, no wound. Only the burns. His face was locked in an expression I will not describe. Volkov knelt and checked for breath. There was none. Grigory asked what could have done this. Volkov did not answer. He stood and told us to wrap the body and tie it to one of the carts. We would bury him at the next well. Batur walked the perimeter while we worked. He found 3 more furrows in the sand. They crossed and recrossed in a pattern that surrounded our camp. He also found a section of ground where the sand had melted into glass. The glass was still warm. It formed a rough circle, perhaps 2 feet across. Timur touched it and pulled his hand back. He said it felt like lightning had struck. But there had been no lightning. The storm had carried no rain, only wind and sand. We left that place as soon as the body was secured. No one wanted to stay. The horses moved without resistance now. They were as eager to leave as we were. We walked through the afternoon and into the evening without stopping. Volkov pushed us hard. When we finally halted for the night, we built no fire. We ate cold rations and spoke in whispers. The stars came out, but they gave no comfort. The desert felt too open, too exposed. During my watch that night, I saw lights moving in the distance. They were low to the ground and yellow. They appeared and disappeared without pattern. I watched them for a long time, trying to understand what they were. They did not move like lanterns. They did not flicker like fire. They simply glowed and faded and glowed again. I did not wake the others. I did not know what I would tell them. At dawn, Volkov gathered us and said we would abandon the southern route. We would turn northwest toward a smaller well he knew from a previous crossing. It would add a day to our journey, but he believed it was safer. No one asked why. We adjusted our heading and started walking. The terrain grew rougher. Low hills appeared. Rocky outcrops broke the monotony of sand. We passed through narrow valleys where the wind funneled and moaned. The horses struggled with the uneven ground. One threw a shoe and had to be led carefully. Progress slowed. On the third day after Chen's death, we lost another man. His name was Jian. He had been a laborer from a small village near Kalgan. Quiet. He kept to himself. He walked near the rear of the line. I was ahead of him by perhaps 20 paces. I heard a short cry and turned. Jian was gone. The sand where he had been standing showed a depression. It was already filling in. I shouted for Volkov. Everyone stopped. We ran back to the spot. There was nothing. No body, no blood, only smooth sand. Batur dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands. Timur joined him. They dug down 2 feet, 3 feet. They found nothing. The sand was undisturbed below the surface. Volkov told them to stop. He said Jian was gone. There was nothing we could do. Grigori asked how a man could simply vanish into sand. Volkov said he did not know. But his voice had changed. He sounded older, tired. We moved away from that spot and kept walking. No one spoke. I kept looking over my shoulder. The desert behind us looked the same as the desert ahead. Flat, empty, waiting. That night we reached the well Volkov had mentioned. It was marked by a pile of stones and a wooden post driven into the ground. The post had carvings on it. Batur studied them and said they were warnings. Old warnings. He said the well was considered cursed by some nomads. Volkov said, we had no choice. We needed water. We lowered the bucket and brought it up. The water was cloudy but drinkable. We refilled our barrels and let the horses drink. Volkov rationed carefully. We had enough now to reach Kobdo if nothing else went wrong. We buried Chen near the well. We had no tools to dig deep, so we covered him with stones and said what words we knew. Grigori read from a small book he carried. The words were in Russian. I did not understand them, but they sounded appropriate. When it was done, we stood in silence for a moment. Then Volkov said we should move on. He wanted distance between us and this place before nightfall. We walked until the well was out of sight behind us. Then we made camp. Volkov posted 3 men on watch this time. Grigory, myself, and Batur. We spread out around the camp with rifles and lanterns. The night was cold and clear. I could see my breath. The stars seemed brighter than before. Too bright. They hurt to look at. Around midnight, the ground began to hum. It started low. I felt it in my teeth before I heard it. The hum grew louder. It resonated. The sand around my boots began to vibrate. Small grains jumped and danced. I looked toward Grigory. His lantern swung wildly. He was backing away from something. I could not see what. Then the sand in the center of our camp erupted upward. Something rose from below. It moved fast. I saw a length of segmented body, thick as a man's torso, pale red, glistening. It twisted in the air and came down across one of the carts. The cart splintered. The sound was like a tree breaking. The creature withdrew back into the sand. The whole event lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Everyone was awake now. Shouting, confusion. Volkov yelled for us to form a line, to stay together. We grabbed what weapons we had and pressed close. The horses were screaming again. One broke its tether and bolted into the dark. We heard it for a moment, and then it stopped. Just stopped. No fade, no distance, only silence. The hum started again, this time from 2 directions, east and west. The creature was circling us. Or there were 2 creatures. I did not know which was worse. Grigory fired his rifle into the sand where the hum seemed loudest. The shot echoed and faded. Nothing happened. Volkov told him to save his ammunition. Bullets would not help us. The attacks came in bursts. The creature would surface, strike, and vanish. We could not predict where it would appear. It moved too fast. One moment the sand was still. The next it exploded upward and something massive crashed down. It took another cart, then a barrel, then it struck near Timur. He dove aside and the creature missed him by inches. I saw its body clearly then. Segmented plates covered it. No eyes, no visible mouth. Just smooth-plated skin that reflected our lantern light in an oily sheen. Batur shouted something in Mongolian. He pointed to the sand near his feet. I saw sparks, small blue sparks jumping between the grains. The hum grew louder. The sparks intensified. Then I understood. The creature was generating an electrical charge. That was how Chen had died, not burned by fire, burned by current. Volkov ordered us to drop anything metal, rifles, buckles, knives, anything that could conduct. We threw them away from us. The hum continued, but the sparks faded. The creature surfaced again, but did not strike. It rose 10 feet into the air and hung there for a moment. I saw its full length, easily 20 feet, perhaps more. Then it dropped back into the sand without sound. The hum stopped. The vibration ceased. The night went silent. We stood frozen, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Volkov whispered for us to gather what we could carry and leave the rest. We would walk through the night. We could not stay here. We salvaged 2 water barrels and as much food as we could carry in sacks. The jade, a few bolts of silk. Everything else we abandoned. The remaining horses were too panicked to control. We let them go. They ran north and disappeared into the dark. We formed a tight group and started walking. Volkov led. I took the rear. Every few steps I looked back. The sand showed no pursuit, but I knew it was there. Beneath us, waiting. We walked for hours. No one spoke. Our breath came hard. The weight of the water and goods pressed on our shoulders. My legs ached. My feet blistered inside my boots. I did not care. I only wanted distance. When the sky began to pale, we were still walking. Volkov did not call a halt until the sun was fully up. We collapsed in a tight circle. Grigori cried, not from fear, from exhaustion. His body shook. Batur checked our heading with the sun and said we were still moving toward Kobdo. Volkov nodded, but did not speak. He sat with his head in his hands. He looked defeated. We rested for an hour. Then we rose and continued. The walking became automatic, 1 foot, then the other. The sun climbed, the heat returned. We drank sparingly. The barrels were heavy, but they would not last long. We had perhaps 2 days of water left. Kobdo was still 3 days away. Volkov said nothing about the shortfall. We all understood. That afternoon we saw riders in the distance. Volkov raised his hand and we stopped. The riders approached slowly. There were 5 of them, Mongolian. They wore long deals and carried bows. They halted a short distance from us and called out. Batur answered. They spoke for several minutes. The riders kept glancing at our group and at the empty desert behind us. Finally, they rode closer. Their leader was an older man with a weathered face and a thin beard. He spoke to Volkov through Batur. He asked where our horses were, where our carts were. Volkov explained briefly. The man listened without expression. When Volkov finished, the man nodded slowly. He said they had heard the storms. He said travelers had gone missing in this region before. He said the earth here was old and angry. He offered us water from their skins and said they would escort us to a camp one day north. From there, we could reach Kobdo safely. Volkov accepted. We walked with the riders until dusk. They led us to a cluster of jades set in a shallow valley. Smoke rose from the center. Dogs barked. Children ran out to watch us arrive. We were given food and tea. The tea was hot and salty, and it burned my throat. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. We ate in silence. The nomads did not ask questions. They had seen men like us before, men who had survived something they could not explain. We stayed 2 days in that camp. We rested. We mended our clothes. Volkov traded some of the jade for horses. 3 old mares that were past their working prime, but still steady. It was enough. On the 3rd morning we thanked the nomads and continued toward Kobdo. The rest of the journey passed without incident. We reached the town 6 days later. We sold what goods remained, the jade, the silk. We split the money evenly among the survivors. It was less than we had hoped, but more than we deserved. We were alive. Grigori returned to Russia. I heard he never spoke of the crossing again. Batur and Timur went back to their families in the steppe. Volkov disappeared. Some said he took a caravan east toward Manchuria. Others said he quit trading altogether. I do not know. I never saw him again. That was 50 years ago. I am an old man now. I have not returned to the Gobi since that summer. Kobdo still stands, but the southern trade route fell out of use. Caravans take the northern road now, longer but safer. I kept a small piece of jade from that trip. Sometimes I hold it and remember the weight in my saddlebag and the sound of sand moving against the wind. I know what hunted us in that desert. I know it moves beneath the surface still, waiting for storms and travelers who wander into its territory. The nomads knew. They had always known. If this account from 1867 gave you chills, please leave a like and help others discover this encounter. Subscribe to Into the Past for more historical horror stories from traders, explorers, soldiers, and pioneers who faced the unknown across the Silk Road, the frontier, the high seas, and the deep wilderness. Drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. Next time, we explore the Appalachian Mountains, where railroad workers in 1873 broke through into something that should have stayed buried. Until then, stay curious, and remember the past holds more than maps can show.